Lily knew the shortcut through the woods was risky, but she was late, and she didn't want to miss the last bus home. The path was narrow and overgrown, rarely used except by those who knew the town well. As she entered the woods, the trees loomed tall and twisted, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out the moonlight. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, shivering as a gust of wind whispered through the trees. The air smelled damp, like the earth after a heavy rain, and the ground was soft beneath her feet. She kept her eyes focused on the path, trying to ignore the shadows that seemed to dance just out of her sight. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of night, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, faded until there was only the sound of her own footsteps. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, she heard a crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. Lily froze, her heart pounding. She looked around, but saw nothing but the dense trees. She tried to convince herself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But as she started walking again, the sound returned, closer this time. Lily's pace quickened. The path seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, with no sign of the clearing that would lead her back to the main road. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her fear growing with each step. Then, from the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. A tall, dark figure, barely visible against the blackness of the woods. She stopped, turning to face it, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Lily felt a wave of dread wash over her. She was no longer alone. Panic set in, and she started to run, her feet pounding the soft earth, the path blurring as her eyes filled with tears. She could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her, growing faster, closer. She didn't dare look back. The only thing that mattered was getting out of the woods. Her legs burned with the effort, her lungs felt like they might burst, but she kept going, fueled by sheer terror. Suddenly, the path opened up. She could see the lights of the road ahead, just beyond the last line of trees. Relief surged through her, and she pushed herself harder, sprinting towards the light. But just as she reached the edge of the woods, something cold and sharp grabbed her ankle, yanking her to the ground. Lily screamed, clawing at the earth, trying to pull herself free, but the grip tightened, dragging her back into the darkness. The last thing she saw before she was pulled under the trees was the moon, peeking through the branches, as if watching her fate unfold. And then, silence. It was past midnight when Sarah finally left the library. She had stayed late studying for her exams, losing track of time as she buried herself in textbooks. Now, the streets were empty, the town deserted except for the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight. The path home was a familiar one, but something about the night felt off. As she walked, Sarah kept her head down, the soft crunch of gravel under her shoes the only sound breaking the silence. The wind had picked up, whispering through the trees that lined the narrow street. She wrapped her jacket tighter around herself, quickening her pace. Then, she heard it, another set of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, falling in rhythm with her own. She froze, listening, but the sound stopped as soon as she did. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see someone there, but the street was empty. Just darkness and the dim glow of the streetlights. She laughed nervously, shaking off the feeling. "It's just your imagination," she muttered, trying to calm herself. She started walking again, but this time, the footsteps returned, closer and more deliberate. Her heart began to race. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. A stray animal, maybe someone else heading home late. But deep down, she knew it was neither. She could feel eyes on her, a presence lurking just out of sight. The footsteps continued, keeping pace with her quickening strides. She turned a corner, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The road ahead stretched on, seemingly endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The footsteps behind her were louder now, closing the distance. Panic set in, and Sarah broke into a run. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the empty street, but no matter how fast she ran, the sound behind her matched her speed. She dared to glance back, and her blood ran cold. There, in the shadows, she saw a figure, tall, shrouded in darkness, its face hidden. It wasn't just following her, it was chasing her. Sarah sprinted, her lungs burning, her legs aching, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her apartment was just a few blocks away. If she could make it there, she would be safe. The sound of her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out everything except the relentless footsteps behind her. Finally, she saw it, her building, just ahead. Relief surged through her, giving her a final burst of energy. She reached the front door, fumbling with her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The footsteps were right behind her now, almost on top of her. She could feel the presence looming over her, suffocating. With a cry, she shoved the key into the lock, twisting it just as the shadow fell over her. She flung the door open, throwing herself inside and slamming it shut behind her. For a moment, she stood there, gasping for breath, her back pressed against the door. The silence was deafening. Sarah's heart slowly calmed as she realized that the footsteps had stopped. She had made it. She was safe. But as she turned to switch on the light, she saw it, reflected in the hallway mirror. The shadowy figure, standing just behind her, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. The cold night air bit into Emily's skin as she walked down the deserted street. The city was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant car horn. She regretted staying out so late, but the party had been worth it until she found herself walking home alone. Her phone's battery had died hours ago, leaving her disconnected from the world. With each step, she felt the darkness pressing closer, as if it had a life of its own. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement. Emily quickened her pace, the soft thud of her footsteps echoing in the stillness. Suddenly, she heard something, a faint sound, like footsteps mirroring her own. She stopped, her heart pounding in her chest, and the sound ceased. Emily turned around, scanning the street, but there was no one there. Just the empty road stretching back into the darkness. "It's just your imagination," she whispered to herself, trying to shake off the fear creeping up her spine. But when she started walking again, the sound returned, footsteps, slightly out of sync with her own. Panic began to set in. She could feel someone or something watching her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she resisted, telling herself that running would only make things worse. She wasn't even sure where she would run to. Her apartment was still blocks away. As she turned a corner, a chill ran down her spine. The street ahead was darker, the streetlights here completely out. The footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. She couldn't take it anymore. Emily broke into a sprint, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she ran towards the safety of her home. But the faster she ran, the louder the footsteps became until they were right behind her. She dared a glance over her shoulder, but the street was still empty, the shadows shifting in unnatural ways. Her legs burned, and her lungs ached, but she kept running. She could see her apartment building now, just a few hundred feet away. Safety. The thought gave her a burst of energy, and she pushed herself harder. Just as she reached her front door, something cold and clammy brushed against the back of her neck. Emily screamed, fumbling with her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She jammed the key into the lock and flung the door open, slamming it shut behind her. She collapsed against the door, panting, her heart racing. Silence filled the apartment, broken only by her ragged breaths. She was safe. She had made it. But as she caught her breath, she heard it again, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps inside her apartment.